ongoing. They are like Danish pastries, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. The evolution takes a long time, and with the time comes the decisions that you make along the way.
So she has multiple canvases going at the same time and works from canvas to canvas and comes back, reworks, washes over. But it's all about creating layers of memory through the creation of these landscapes. She first went to Heerland in 1997 and absolutely fell in love with the landscape, as many Australian artists and international artists continue to do.
That landscape is her muse. The landscape is also a metaphor for her life and her emotional state. Heerland is a place that surrounds her with physical beauty and presence of nature, but it's also a place for her to explore her own psychology and her own relationship with nature. It's a deeply emotional landscape for her. It's a spiritual landscape, and it holds within it an incredible personal history of personal change and evolution for her. She's living her paintings and living her practice there.
Heerland was an escape from Sydney at the time. My children were very young, and the children were not allowed to play in the front yard in those days in the suburbs, and I was always concerned about them. But here I felt to allow them to have the freedom to wander through the town by themselves, and they just loved it.
That landscape is imbued with her connection to her family through that landscape, and that very much comes out in the work that she does there. So you've got those beautiful layered canvases that are quite evocative, almost ghostly in terms of the kind of soft layering and the muted colours that she brings through those canvases. It's an emotional connection with the landscape that you can see through the painting.
As with all her paintings, place is a state of the mind and an emotional state for Danelle. So she's not necessarily rendering exactly what she sees. She's rendering the emotional response to immersing herself in that landscape.
I grew up with my mother and my sister, and our lounge room was our studio, and I thought everybody lived this way. My mother worked very hard. She worked in a commercial art industry, and she'd bring home work on the weekends. And we'd have sculptors going, painting easels up. It was a little chaotic, but it was fun. I was always drawing, particularly people. I was always, fascinated with personalities and facial expressions and things.
I've only really had my portrait painted twice, notably. With Danelle, it didn't take long before the conversation was intimately concerned with life and how you feel about life.
And that painting is not just about the physical Jack, it's about the emotional Jack, it's about the sound of Jack, the stature, the larger-than-life Jack.
Both myself and my wife and our son were there when she unveiled it for us. And I was deeply moved. Somehow, she has managed to see something about me, my character, myself, and that's there in that portrait. And when you see it as the subject of that portrait, you are immediately extraordinarily vulnerable and open.
Danelle is just an incredibly courageous artist who is, due to her deep connection with landscape and her desire to experience it, she will place herself within an environment without really taking into consideration the threats or dangers of that place. And I think in order for her to be touched by the full experience of nature, she will make herself very vulnerable to that place and almost strip herself bare so she can be exposed to the elements at large. She has this insatiable need to experience the elements and to be touched by nature.
While I was staying in the Northern Territory, I would go off and explore parts of the countryside. And I discovered just off the highway one day, there was this lake. It was so beautiful. It was pristine. It was almost like a little slice of heaven almost. It was just, you could see the water lilies floating on this almost unreal blue. And without even thinking, I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And I stood at the outermost point, so I was completely surrounded by water. I realized what an idiot I was. I knew these were croc-infested waters. I call this series Deception, because if you think of life, often on the surface things look beautiful and perfect, but underneath there lurks danger.
There's an undercurrent that something deeper is going on. It's like a ripple in a pond, but there'll be ripples and then everything will be calm again. And I think that's a real metaphor for how Danelle sees her practice and her world. She delves into these scenes, but they're actually her exploring things that have happened in her life. So she brings the past into these works to work through them. In many ways, it's a cathartic act.
The story about this painting began with my first journey to Hill End. One day, my son took himself off to the bush and he went wandering. He came back, said, "Mum, I found the most beautiful place in the whole world. And I have to take you there and we're going to take a picnic." So that's what we did. And an hour and a half later, we've opened from this forest or this bush, and then all of a sudden this little opening where the sun just shone in, just sufficiently to this little open ground next to a gully. And we sat there and had our picnic, but he thought it was just like heaven for him. My son, Shannon, he died when he was only 17 years old in 2000. I still think of him as being here. I've never accepted that. It was the saddest time. All the works were about that at the time. And everything was about remembering, feeling, allowing it to explore all those emotions.
It's how you deal with the here and now that is the measure of your life, not what you have had. That's what you have. It's what you do with it that makes you who you are. And it's interesting, it's expressed in her painting.
In 2019, New South Wales was suffering from the severe bushfires. Danelle is in Hill End and witnessing the transformation of the landscape as a result of the fires and the ability to regenerate following tragedy and devastation allowed her or gave her the opportunity to reflect on her own life, her incredible strength and her ability to evolve from her own tragedy and transform her life. Danelle has the ability to go beneath the surface and to render what is there that is unseen. It's the memory, the recollection, the smell, the taste, the sound,